Hello, I'm Tom.
And I'm Hanne. Welcome to the Digital Behavior Podcast, a podcast about human behavior in the digital world.
In this podcast, we help you to understand what drives online behavior, how we can measure this, and the impact on the wider world.
Today, we're going to meet Stephen Hobbs, an expert in digital storytelling. Stephen has worked with a range of clients such as Google, Volvo, O2, and American Express.
This is going to be a fantastic episode. Let's meet Stephen. Well, welcome to the podcast, Stephen. Would you mind introducing yourself before we go any further?
Thank you. Good morning, Tom. Good morning, Hanne. It's lovely speaking. My name's Stephen Hobbs. I'm a digital storyteller, which means I use digital channels and media to create content for brands and organizations that want to reach high-value customers in digital channels. I've spent 20 years doing this. I started my career as a journalist and I was an editor on national titles, including British GQ and the Sunday Times. After that, I founded and subsequently sold a successful content marketing agency. And I've held leadership positions at global ad groups, including WPP, iCrossing, and Ogilvy. But these days, I'm a consultant. I live down in the sunny Southwest with my dog and my young children and my wife, and spend as much time surfing as I do consulting, which seems like a good balance.
That does sound amazing, actually. Welcome to the podcast. And generally, what a fascinating topic, storytelling. And can you share your perspective on why storytelling is so effective in digital marketing, especially in today's fast-paced online environment?
Yeah, and I think as human beings, we're hardwired for stories, right? It's how we have always made sense of the world around us. Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, is really clear on those processes that we go through when we make decisions and try to understand things in front of us. And I think probably we call it a post-truth world, don't we? You know, the rise of Trump, the rise of the far right, even reform here in the Southwest. We live in a very confusing time. And I think more than ever, people want to hold on to stories. And I think the technology that we have lived with, that we've grown up around, that has changed our lives over the last couple of decades, has really augmented that. You know, we need things to hold on to in this world. The average person takes in 34 gigabytes of data on a daily basis. That's insane. That's like 100,000 words reading or 2.5 hours worth of video that you're consuming. You know, we see 4,000 to 10,000 adverts a day in our digital surfing. So in order to cut through that, you really have to be telling stories that make a connection. We've started to phase that stuff out. So it's one of those things that I think, human beings need to hold on to. And I think, it's a very human need.
You mentioned quite a distinguished career that you've had to date. You interestingly started out as a journalist. You mentioned, I think, GQ magazine. And I guess, does that give you a slightly different perspective on marketing? You know, marketers tend to, and we're probably guilty of this at business schools, we tend to teach students about things like objectives and identifying specific audiences, but we don't necessarily think about each person as an individual and perhaps how they might absorb information through a story, whereas you're a journalist originally, and perhaps you might think about how you package up information in a slightly different way to the way that traditional marketers might.
I think that's a good question. I think I think that there is truth in it. Yeah. So I remember being sort of 19 years old and sitting in an editorial room with a bunch of really smart, hard-smoking, hard-bitten hacks. And these guys knew how to tell a story, and it sort of was normalized. You know, you thought everybody could do this. And a lot of credit to those guys and women who would take the time with me to go through my work with a red pen and teach me the basics of constructing a story. The single best piece of information or the piece of advice that I was ever given was that the truth sounds different. So if you can tell your truth, if you can be honest about what you have discovered and make it meaningful to you, people will identify with that. They will identify. It sounds different. People know it when they hear it. If you're trying to force it, if you're trying to fake it, if it's sophistry in any way, people see through it. It doesn't resonate. So I absolutely think that storytelling sort of grounding, that real kind of craft of creating a written story has been incredibly helpful, because I agree, it is all about the audience. I think whenever I go to see clients, and this is the majority of cases, not the minority of cases, the first thing they will say to me is, look, we've got this really sophisticated brand proposition. People just don't seem to be buying it. And it's like, take a second, stop telling them what you want to say. Take a moment to listen to what they want to hear, because they're telling you. There are so many channels for them to tell you exactly what it is they're looking for, what it is they want. If you reframe that position from the outset and start responding to their needs, does your product answer a need? What is that need? How is it manifested by the people who buy your product? That's where we start.
I wonder if that also relates to the difference between cognitive or sort of rational messaging and emotional messaging, effective messaging, as we might call it. I mean, obviously storytelling is all about emotion, really. It's all about remembering things, not just in isolation, but attached to a story, but attached to some kind of meaning. And most stories have some kind of emotion attached to them. So I wonder if that's part of the key to it. There's a book about this. I think it's called something to do with long-term and short-term. I'll come to this and put it in the notes at the end of the podcast. There's a book all about basically the difference between rational advertising and emotional advertising, and the outcome really is that emotional advertising is far more effective in the long term. Rational advertising helps in the moment. If you're in a supermarket and you see 50% off, you're more likely to buy that product. But if you want people to remember a brand, actually it's the emotions, it's perhaps the story that attaches to that. So is that your perspective as well, that actually it's not just conveying a message, but it's actually conveying that with emotion that makes a difference?
Well, I think horses for courses. You don't buy emotion from your bank, for example. You want them to be good at what they do. You want them to be a safe pair of hands. Yeah, it always used to be that division, the division you're talking about really was sort of B2B versus B2C. This idea that B2B marketers had to sell the benefit of the product. They had to talk about how it was helpful, how it helped you in your day-to-day work. Now, I think whereas B2C, you were buying a dream, you were selling the sizzle, not the steak, right? And I think modern B2B marketers sort of went, well, is that true? Because I think most people buy on emotion. Most people buy on feeling. Now, there are exceptions to that, and there remain exceptions to that. And there are certainly moments in any purchase journey where one of the considerations are function. Does this do the job I want it to do? Does it do it effectively? Does it do it better than its competitors? And probably a car is part of that. But I think there is a blend to be had. And at different stages in the purchasing journey, you're telling different stories.
And that's really interesting. And I think it's not just, that it's different purchase situations, but you also, I guess, need to take the individual into consideration. As you said earlier, Stephen, that people are different. People have different sort of preferences of how they like the story to be told, for example, and knowing your audience is quite important. There was a really interesting study actually last year by Aisha and Bouzabia in the journal, let me just double check, Qualitative Market Research Journal. And they really looked at the responses to storytelling and advertising, but from a cultural context. So they were exactly trying to determine whether different cultures have different responses to storytelling. And this sample was, I think, Tunisia and France. And I think especially for sort of international marketers, somebody who's got an audience that is quite divided or different in their characteristics, is really essential to understand these things as well. And they found, for example, I think it was the Tunisians reacting more cognitively and the French more emotionally, and were more drawn to storytelling in an emotional context, whereas the Tunisian sample was more drawn to rational storytelling. So I think it's just important to note that actually it's not one glove fits all, but actually you need to have a good understanding of who your audience is.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. There is and has always been this Western-centric idea that, the large American and UK based organizations will come up with a big idea in English. They'll translate it and they'll expect to ship it all around the world, and then be really surprised when it falls over in other countries. And, I was having this conversation with a client only yesterday, actually. So I'm working on a global comms project for a transformation for an enormous multinational. And we were talking about exactly this. How do we translate this stuff into other markets? Now, my experience has been that you can create a really beautiful emotional story in the UK that will work in America, but it will completely fall flat in China, where there is a completely different cultural set of resonances and touch points for these kinds of things. And the most effective way to do it, in my view at least, is you start with it. And this is constantly a challenge, isn't it? That's that idea of the centralized organization and the diffuse organization. The markets always want their own version. The center always wants consistency of messaging from the central perspective, but there is a place in between that. And an effective way to do that I have found is that you start with this central idea, the big idea. It's probably in English. And when I say big idea, I mean great. Big idea is a very old marketing idea. Actually, a big idea these days is probably a lot of very little ideas that appear in well-structured places. But you start off with those things. You create a toolkit. You hand it to the local market and you say, okay, let's make your version of this. What resonates? You know your audience best in your market. This is what we're going to say. This is how we're going to say it. These are your key visuals. These are some key scripts. These are the main videos or the animations that we're going to use. But I want you to put a localized spin on it. And that devolves some of that creation into real language. Otherwise, what you're doing is you're passing it through, and forgive me, an AI translator. You end up with a poorly translated version of the original, which falls flat in every other territory.
The book that I mentioned on this, by the way, about the difference between rational and emotional is called The Long and the Short of It. It's actually published by the IPA for anyone interested. Again, we can put the link in the notes later on. I'm interested, Stephen, if we focus on the emotional side, which is obviously more related to storytelling, there's so much content out there. What are your particular strategies for creating a brand story that's going to resonate with a particular audience? Are there any particular approaches? Of course, every brand story is different, but are there any particular approaches that you tend to replicate when you visit a client?
It all starts with old-fashioned research. It all starts with talking to people. It all starts, and there are so many ways you can do that now. And I don't want to get diverted, but for many, many years, when we started that research, the brands would send me this kind of persona sheet, right? And they were nonsense, absolute nonsense. By those personas, King Charles and Ozzy Osbourne have exactly the same set of interests, right? No, they don't. That is completely clear. So we live in an age where we can be much, much cleverer about finding out who our audiences are. And I don't care if it's picking up the phone and talking to somebody or doing a really immersive piece of online digital social listening, quant research, but start there. Don't start in the C-suite where somebody says, do you know what? I know exactly what this product is, because that is absolute nonsense. So it starts with the audience. It starts with identifying their needs, and it starts with identifying lots of different sets of audiences and needs. We can segment. We've been doing that for 20 years on email. People don't like to talk about email. They're like, oh, it's so old school. Still the most effective marketing channel that we have digitally. But also, if you have an email database and you're segmenting them properly, you know who your buyers are, you know what they like, you know what makes them tick, and you can start to replicate those audiences on as many different channels as you want, whether that's social media, whether that's PPC, makes no difference, but you are reaching people with the message that they want, with respect for their difference and their slightly different needs, and you're answering those needs.
And just in terms of how you would engage those particular audiences, once you've identified them and understood what their needs are going to be, you might be familiar. There's a book by Christopher Booker that basically says there are 7 basic stories that you can use to package up information. I don't know if you subscribe to that view or if that resonates with you at all, or maybe there's a different way that you would actually go about creating a story to meet those needs that you've just identified.
Sure. Brooker is a tricky case, isn't he? I mean, he's a problematic character in lots of ways. It took him 34 years to write that book. He read the sum total of human literature in order to get there. And it is definitely, when you read it, an infuriating thing with flashes of brilliance. But for me, it falls short. And it falls short for a number of reasons, right? It feels like one of those ideas that got bigger than the research. He starts out with 9 different plots. Then he rejects 2 of those and says there are actually 7. On the way, he does this kind of examination of different great pieces, Hamlet, for example. And he rejects it because it doesn't have a happy ending. He sort of says, well, Shakespeare got this wrong. He ends up condemning Rigoletto, Wagner, Proust, James Joyce, Kafka, and he praises Terminator 2. Look, I love Terminator 2. It's a great book. It's a great movie, but it is not. It's not Ulysses. And let's take Ulysses. How does Ulysses fit into that? Is it a quest? Probably it's a quest, but Stephen and Bloom don't go anywhere. They stay right there in Dublin. The Iliad. A tragedy, but what is Hector's tragic flaw? Nobody agrees on that. Some people say, oh, well, in book 18, he rejects the prophecy, so it must be pride. I'm not sure. He acts out of duty throughout that movie. Achilles, he certainly doesn't go, it's not quest, he doesn't go home, he died. Achilles is not interested in going on anybody's quest. He doesn't go home. So what is the Iliad, according to Brooker? What it is a really nice story, okay? It's a simple, reductive, fairly useful first point of contact. I'm a journalist. Never let the facts get in the way of a really good story. And I'm pretty sure that Brooker didn't.
That's really interesting. I think, again, as we said a couple of times now, sort of you have to look at it case by case basis, isn't it? It sort of works for some, it doesn't work for others. Works in some contexts and it doesn't. One really interesting thing you said sort of previously to discussing Booker is that, ideally you would have a segmented marketplace, you would be talking to and would, I guess, adjust the messaging based on who you're communicating with. Now, that's an ideal case. That's a great scenario, but it also sounds very resource intense. If you have to adjust the message, if you have to adjust storytelling. Now, there's quite a lot of sort of arguments in the marketing profession that, AI can help make all of this more efficient, and adjust what you want to say based on different audiences, but with the help of AI. What's your opinion? What would you say how has the rise of AI changed your approach to storytelling and marketing? And do you think AI is a tool that enhances creativity or one that limits it?
Sure. Look, this is an annoying response to your question, which is, it's a central question, but it is both, right? It both limits and enhances. It is an incredibly useful research tool. When identifying those audiences, when identifying those segments, it's much faster than I can do it manually. It's a step on from those tools like Salesforce and that we've been using for a couple of decades. So it is very good as a starting point. But it's not a creative tool. First and foremost, it's not a creative tool. Like a carpenter is an incredibly talented man who uses a number of tools and knows when to use the right tools to create something of beauty. AI is just another tool. A saw in itself is not a creative tool, right? And you can't trust it. It can't do the imagineering bit. Okay, so yesterday, I'm working for a brand. They are putting together a list of events for next year that they could theoretically partner with or have, sort of relationships with. So I asked the junior researcher at the brand in the marketing team to put me together a list of appropriate events that we can start talking about and thinking about. So she does what every Gen Z does, and she feeds it into ChatGPT, and immediately 30 seconds later emails me the list. And the first thing on the list is London will be hosting the summer 2025 Olympics, which it won't. It just won't. And 1 second's Googling would have proven that. So this misinformation is passed on so fast. But that list was 30 seconds into my inbox, right? And that 30 seconds is a replacement of 3 hours of trawling through looking for appropriate. Now, all I have to do is sense check the things on those. And that's not a big job. Worse, if you get it to do the heavy lifting of writing an article for you or, writing a script, it's going to start hallucinating stuff. And it's going to make things up to fill in the holes. And if you haven't done the research, you don't know what it's made up. So you're going to spend as long editing it as you would have done to sit down and write that first draft yourself. So it's a tool. It's a research tool. It's a useful tool. But, it's the old adage, garbage in, garbage out.
I wonder, Stephen, about the role of AI-generated content. So obviously we're talking here slightly about using AI for research and to generate, or to save time in Googling, I suppose. But I wonder about if you create a story and then you feed that into, actually, I do know a company in Bristol actually that's producing AI-generated videos, for example, that look like the managing director, the chief executive of a company, but as actually generated through AI. And if you're feeding the story into something like that, where it's just the presentation of the information which is AI generated, whether you think that might affect authenticity. And there was a paper actually in Psychology of Marketing looking at different types of human presentation, so an augmented digital human versus a real human, and actually it generally found that the effect of each was pretty similar actually, and what made the difference in so-called narrative transportation, whether people are absorbed in the story, was whether the story fitted the product, not whether it was an AI generated or an augmented person or a real person. So I wonder whether you agree with that, whether you see a difference in how people absorb AI generated augmented material versus real material.
Yeah, I think time will tell. I think at the moment we are fascinated by the novelty, right? I also think that, look, there is no doubt when it comes to creating video, if you are a skilled storyteller and you know how to use the tools, you can create video much, much faster and much, much cheaper than you can with a film crew going out and shooting or using its CGI team to build what you want. If I want to create a story right now that involves a cat wearing an eye patch in a flying car, I can do that. And it looks great and it's fun. Now I think that and we've been talking about the uncanny valley since the 70s. I think there comes a point where people are creeped out by things that are not real, that look too real. And that we're having that conversation as a society against deep fakes at the moment. And those conversations are going to continue. I also think that, well, look, you're academics, you teach students, you can tell when an AI essay is handed into you, and you can tell because it doesn't sound human. It's 2D. There is something missing, and it's that thing. It's that human connection we've been talking about. That truth. It doesn't move you. It might be slick. The language is a bit wonky, but that will probably improve. But I said it to you earlier, the truth sounds different. And I don't think these tools will ever be able to capture the truth. A facsimile of it, but I think we're going to know.
And do you think there are any ethical issues with a brand using AI to generate, story-based information, for example? Should they declare that this has been generated? Now, the company I mentioned that's making videos, for example, should they make sure that all of the brands they work with, all the clients they work with, actually say this is actually not the managing director for real? It was generated by an AI model.
I mean, I'm not sure if there is a need for declaration. I do think that, of course, there are ethical issues. People talk about AI. One of my favorite names for it that I hear a lot is it's plagiarism software, and that is what it is, right? I mean, it goes out and it can only feed on what has gone before, and there will be lawsuits in the future about IP. As with all of this technology, it's moving faster than legislation can keep up. But my problem is exactly that. You're only feeding on what has gone before, which means you are just gradually reducing everything to a median. We had this conversation 15 years ago when everyone was saying, creative has to be data driven. We have to be using big data. Now, why is that a nonsense? If I want to make a new ice cream and I look at the data, I only make vanilla ice cream. 42% of people in the UK told Tesco's that they like vanilla ice cream best. It's a dead winner. And then Ben & Jerry's released a whole series of ice creams into the market and built $1 billion business on ice creams that didn't have a flavor in the name. What the hell is fish food? What the hell is Chunky Monkey? What does that taste like? I don't care. I like it. It's fun. It's funny. And I want it on my table in my freezer. You don't get the next smash hit by just distilling everything that's gone before. You do something different. And that is something that we will see. We will see as everything sort of sinks to the same thing. There'll be these weird blips of things that stand out. And they stand out because they're not like anything else. And we have always done that in advertising. Gorillas playing drums, aliens from another planet eating mashed potato. We like that stuff.
And Stephen, you're saying that's AI would be difficult for AI to come up with, because all they do is regurgitate, what they found or what they find online, what they find has worked before. Instead of coming up.
Yeah, reducing everything to a median because it can't imagine. It's not sentient. It's not creative. It is an accumulator. That's all it is.
If you think back to sort of the campaigns you've worked on, and I guess mainly that is the human-made campaigns, and can you walk us through an example where storytelling in particular made a significant impact on a campaign's success, and what elements of that story sort of resonated the most with the audience? Is that sort of one campaign you really remember as being, particularly successful because of its storytelling aspect?
As I said before, so there's this idea in a brand that you can just tell them what you want to and people will lap it up. So I did a project for a massive international, very famous tech organization that rhymes with Google. And they wanted to reach marketers with their products and services, which were great at identifying little tiny insights from huge data sets. And they had been, so they had put editorial control. So they'd hired these phenomenally expensive and great journalists and writers, tech journalists. They'd put them in a room and then they'd made sales and marketing be the overarching editors, right? So every time these really talented people would create a piece and give it to them, the sales guys would go, well, how's this help me sell YouTube? And the marketing guys would say, well, but this doesn't talk about brand at all. And they'd send it back and they'd ruin these pieces of work And then eventually, after 3 months, they get this sort of terrible combination of everybody's point of view, which they would then, put it out on email or put out on the website. And weirdly, nobody would read it. I mean, who knew? And all it took was to say, look, you have the most powerful data set in the world. You are pulling from those data sets pieces of insight that no human could find. Can we talk about those outputs, not the tool that did it? Can we do that? And we'll prove that to you with variant testing. I understand that you need proof. So we're going to send 50% of your audience who are marketers of automobiles. We're going to send them a piece of data from your data set, use from your tools, that says people look for cars between September and November every year. And we're going to send the other half of them a puff piece about the tool that can find this data. Now, look, unsurprisingly, with that audience in that market, the open rates for the email that said people search cars between September and November was opened, 75%, a huge open rate. And nobody opened the other one, nobody. You've got to understand what it is those people are looking for immediately. All you have to do now is look at verticals. Now we're talking verticals. Now we're talking about insights and verticals that are going to help me as a marketer sell my product, not the tool that's going to get me there.
Stephen, I know we've talked quite a bit about AI. I just wondered if you see any particular opportunities or challenges that content creators or marketers more generally need to start considering for the future. Whether it is just AI, whether there are other things that you think are going to affect the future of this area of brand development, storytelling.
I think, look, I love these tools. I've spent a lifetime being excited by the new stuff that comes out. AR is going to change everything. I saw a Meta ad last night on TV about somebody in a long waiting queue somewhere who just pops on a headset and is at the cinema. These are great things, right? There will come a point where there is a crossover between gaming, movies, and narrative storytelling, where I can place myself within my favorite movie and I can play a game as part of that movie, and all of those things come together and I can buy stuff while I'm there. That's gonna change everything. People talk about those sort of adverts where I walk down the street, it recognizes me and it personalizes an advert straight to me. I think we're quite a long way from that, but I think that an uncanny valley situation will happen there. And I also think we'll block out that stuff really quickly. We'll start to just ignore it. But I think the more entertaining and immersive, and the more you can cross over, putting product placement, but within a world that I want to visit, I think that's going to change everything. But look, let me finish on this sort of example. There's a guy I know who runs a series of restaurants, and he is looking for ways to get people into his restaurants in dead time. His restaurants are in highly sought after bits of tourist towns around the southwest. He feeds all of his data, his working data, his restaurant data into AI. He does the same. He connects it to data from things like hotel bookings and stuff like that. AI identifies to him that Thursday nights are a competitive night. Nobody goes out. It's probably changeover day. All the restaurants are suffering that night. That's the night to run some kind of promo. It figures out his finances and reckons that it's economical for him to run a 10% discount. He prints up flyers. He does social advertising saying 10% discount, and nobody comes. Nobody comes. He says to me, what do we do instead? We look at the data. We figure out that it's right. we say, well, okay, what is 10% discount? 10% discount is exactly the same as saying the 10th person eats free. Free is incredibly powerful. Now, if you overuse it, it devalues the thing. But winning, now that is a thing that people don't logically hold on to, they emotionally feel. So on a Thursday night, when people are in their restaurant, when they finish their meal, he brings over a spin the wheel, which has a 1 in 10 chance of winning your meal for free. His place is now packed on a Thursday night. Now, the other unintended consequence is people spend more. Because what idiot goes for the second cheapest bottle of wine when they might get the meal for free? AI can show you opportunities. It is human cunning that gives you the opportunity to build on that opportunity and take advantage of it. And that is not going to change. Human creativity using these tools. There'll be job losses. Art workers are going to fall off. Some copywriters are going to go, but more jobs will be created. And we will get back to a place where real creativity is easier to enable. And we can create those worlds that are in our minds, that are in our imaginations. But the tools aren't going to do it.
No, I just want to say, let's hope we don't lose that creativity because people think they don't have to use it. You know, if, as you said, like younger generations heavily rely on AI. Let's hope there's still going to be that sort of drive to actually develop creativity and learn from one another. Steve, it was really brilliant. Thank you very much for sort of sharing your insights. I think you let us know and our listeners know how it's best to get in touch with you if anybody would like to sort of follow up or, you know, I guess work with you or hear from you. What's the best way to get in touch?
That'll be lovely. I am on LinkedIn. I'm on all of those channels, but LinkedIn is probably the best way to find me. It's Stephen Hobbs or /Shobsy, SHOBBSY. You'll find me on LinkedIn. I look forward to talking to you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your time, Stephen.
Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very much for having me.